The vintage Rolex DateJust has historically been considered your best bet for getting into the world of Rolex, both in terms of affordability and accessibility. The availability of watches in good condition and the price of these watches made them great proposition bets, and as it turns out, over the last 3 to 5 years, they were great bets indeed. It used to be, not too long ago, you could pick up a nice example of a watch like this, which is a model 1603 DateJust, for under $2,500, maybe even at prices below $2,000. And if you did that a few years ago, today you'd have nearly doubled your money. So yeah, a rather good bet indeed. But what about today, and looking forward to the future? Is picking up a 1970s era DateJust that trades between $4,000 and $5,000 still a good bet? Well, nobody knows for sure, but if we had a crystal ball 5 years ago, we'd have been buying these watches hand over fist. Now, as I mentioned, this is a Rolex DateJust reference 1603, dated to somewhere from the 1970s, and a viewer of the channel was kind enough to loan me this watch to check out for a week and to film a video. So, first and foremost, thanks to John for giving me some time with your watch. I greatly appreciate it. The Rolex DateJust reference 1603 was produced by the brand through the 1960s all the way up to the early 1980s, and as such, there are a lot of examples of these watches out there in the hands of private collectors and dealers for sale on the pre-owned market. Alongside this model, Rolex also produced the reference number 1601, the main difference being the bezel design and the materials used for construction. This 1603 model we have here today is a fantastic example with a dark gray dial on a Jubilee bracelet running a caliber 1570 automatic movement. The watch's dimensions measure in at 36 millimeters in diameter with a roughly 43 to 44 millimeter wingspan, which is from the top to the bottom of the watch's case. The watch thickness is about 12 millimeters and the bracelet rides between the lugs at 20 millimeters in width. The watch has an acrylic crystal with Cyclops magnifier covering that gray pie pan dial. And of course, it has a screw-down crown, and the watch is topped with a classic engine-turned bezel. On the wrist, the 36mm size is conservative, to say the least. You're either a fan of smaller watches or you're not. Now, personally, I am, and I enjoy watches between 36 and 38mm as I think it wears really well on my 6 3/4-inch wrist. But I know a lot of you guys are going to prefer watches in a more contemporary size, and for those guys, this is most definitely not the watch for you. But if you want something that's a bit under the radar and it doesn't grab the attention a watch sized at 41mm and above might, I highly recommend finding and trying one of these on. You might absolutely love it. So the movement in this watch is, as previously mentioned, a 1570 caliber, which predates the 3035 movement by quite a while, and more importantly, it doesn't have a quick set date. Yes, it is hand-winding and hacking, but if you need to change the date, you have the somewhat laborious task of manually advancing the time forward, hour by hour, until you reach the desired date setting. Another interesting thing about this movement is that it runs at a much slower rate of 19,800 vibrations per hour, whereas modern 3000 series movements run at the more typical rate of 28,000 vibrations per hour. In fact, the beat rate of 19,800 or 2.75 Hz is even slower than the traditional 3 Hz rates that we see in movements running at 21,600. Now, does this really matter? In my opinion, no, not at all, and some people would suggest that this lower rate is actually even better because it causes less wear and tear on the movement, which might explain why so many of these watches still exist even after 50 years. The engine-turned bezel is interesting, and it gives a much different vibe than the much more common fluted bezels that we see on contemporary Rolex DateJust models. I actually like it quite a bit. It's perhaps not quite as flashy as a fluted bezel, but it's also not as simple as a smooth bezel either. It's sort of in between casual and opulent, and it gives the watch a touch of something, I don't know, just a little extra without going overboard. Of course, that's not to say that I dislike fluted bezels. I think they're awesome. But having an option like this, something that's just a little bit different, is nice, and I wish this option was still available in the Rolex lineup today. Another small detail that probably goes largely overlooked is the pie pan dial. On the outer edge of the dial, just where the chapter ring meets the hour markers, we see a small step on the dial that gives it just a hint of depth on what would otherwise be a fairly simple flat matte dial. That little extra dimension is a really cool touch that makes this model stand out, and it gives it just a little bit of uniqueness that I really like. Now the stick markers, applied Rolex logo, and the handset are DateJust staples that have been hallmarks of the brand and this model for ages. And like the Rolex Submariner model, it has a consistency in its design that ties both the older and the more modern versions of this watch together, even though they might be decades apart and have otherwise had numerous revisions and updates. The Jubilee bracelet is another design staple that the DateJust has become known for. And yeah, sure, you can find DateJust models on the more sporty Oyster bracelet. It's not entirely uncommon. But for many people, a DateJust should be on a Jubilee just like this, and I tend to agree. It's insanely comfortable on the wrist, and it really looks great on this type of bracelet. Now, being an older model, yes, this Jubilee bracelet has hollow links and a stamped friction steel locking clasp, but you don't even notice that stuff when it's on the wrist. And given the ample amount of micro adjustment points on the clasp, you can guarantee that you're going to find a perfect fit for all-day comfort, which to me is of paramount importance when wearing a watch, so I can overlook all the rest of it. Besides, it's kind of a sign of the times that this watch was made in, and it has a certain charm to its simplicity. Something else you don't see on modern Rolexes anymore is the holes case. The holes in the lugs let the user more easily remove the bracelet if you ever decide that you'd like to switch it over to a leather strap, or even if you'd like to just take the bracelet off for cleaning. It's a convenience feature that you don't fully appreciate until you need it, and another one of those signs of the type of features that you don't see too often anymore, because I think designers now seem to value form over function more. So the question remains, is the vintage Rolex DateJust still a good purchase in 2021 and beyond? Well, there's a couple of ways to look at that. First, it's still one of the more affordable ways to get a Rolex on your wrist, and they are just as cool as brand new modern Rolex DateJusts, at least in my opinion. So from that perspective, if you like the watch and you want to wear it, then yes, it's absolutely still worth purchasing today. However, from a quote-unquote investment perspective, will they continue to appreciate in value over the next 5 or, say, 10 years like they have previously? Well, that's kind of a tough one to answer, and we can really only guess at this point. But my thoughts are that they will probably slow down significantly, or simply hold their value where they're at. As they begin to approach the price of an Oyster Perpetual, I think it becomes harder for people to justify the cost compared to getting something that's brand new. Of course, if you can actually get the new watch that you want in the first place. And I guess that's kind of the key. If the availability of new watches remains low, the values of pre-owned watches will do nothing but continue to grow. Alright guys, that will wrap this one up for today. As always, thanks for tuning in and checking out the show. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at this Rolex DateJust reference 1603 with me as much as I've enjoyed sharing it with you. And one more big thank you to John for loaning me his watch to make this video. I really appreciate the generosity and support. Without the help and the support from viewers like you, this YouTube channel simply wouldn't exist today. So with all that said, I guess I'm going to go ahead, sign off, and say bye now.